Hello everyone. This video will introduce some of the basic concepts and tools used in reconstructing arguments. Let's begin with what an argument is. An argument isn't a shouting match or even a dispute between two parties. An argument is a special kind of set of statements. In an argument, some statements are presented as evidence that logically supports one or more of the other statements. The evidence statements are known as premises, and the statements supported by them are known as conclusions. Successful arguments offer evidence that makes their conclusions reasonable to believe. Now let's take a look at argument reconstruction. Arguments in the wild are often messy things. They can be poorly organized, at least from a logical point of view. They'll frequently leave important elements out. They can contain extraneous information, and they can state important information in a way that is vague or ambiguous. The task of argument reconstruction, simply put, is to present an argument as clearly, completely, and charitably as we possibly can. I compare the process of argument reconstruction to that of reconstructing an artifact from the shards and fragments scattered in the ruins of a past civilization. The process takes care, attention, and some background knowledge about the culture, but the goal is to put the pieces together, fill in the gaps, and develop an understanding of the form and function of the whole. Why should we bother with argument reconstruction? Different people can have different reasons for wanting to reconstruct an argument from a text, which can be either the written or spoken word. Some people may just find the process of argument reconstruction pleasurable. It's enjoyable for its own sake. Other people might have to do it as part of their job. For instance, a prosecutor or a defense attorney will definitely have to understand the opposing side's argument because it's their job to undermine it. However, sometimes we're genuinely curious whether someone has presented us with a cogent argument so that we can decide whether we should adopt the viewpoint ourselves. So if our ultimate goal is to decide whether to accept or reject a particular argument, what we're going to have to do is evaluate the argument. We're going to have to check to see whether the premises are true, whether the argument is valid or invalid, or inductively strong or weak, or whether it commits one of the informal fallacies. In order to evaluate the argument, we have to understand what the argument is, and that's the objective of argument reconstruction. Let's take a look at arguments in standard form. The best way to understand what standard form is to see an example. So here's one. This is an argument against human free will. And as you can see, it's a numbered list of statements. The first three are premises. They're numbered P1, P2, P3. Below them is a horizontal line that separates them from the conclusion. Below the line is the conclusion, indicated by the three dots on the left, and the conclusion indicator word hence. This argument says every physical event is strictly determined by prior physical events. The second premise states every human action is a physical event. The third premise says if a human action is strictly determined by prior physical events, then it's unfree. Therefore, according to this argument, all human actions are unfree. Once we see the argument in standard form, it's much easier to evaluate it. We have a set of questions about this argument. Are the premises true, for instance? Is the argument deductively valid? Does it commit any fallacies? When we have an argument in standard form, it positions us to ask those kinds of questions, which are part of the process of evaluating the argument. When people state their arguments, they usually leave clues or signals to their readers or listeners that they're introducing certain parts of their argument. These are conclusion and premise indicator words. Very common, but this is not an exhaustive list, some very common premise indicator words are since, the reason being, assuming that, for the reason that, for, because, in view of the fact that, given that, as indicated by, or due to the fact that. Some very common conclusion indicator words are thus, so, consequently, it follows that, which means that, hence, therefore, as a result, we can conclude that, which implies that. Premise and conclusion indicator words are discussed by both authors of our course textbooks, by Merrily Salmon on pages 15 to 19, and by Schick and Vaughn on page 36. In the final chapter of On the Origin of Species, Darwin stated, "This whole volume is one long argument." Now, most arguments don't take 450 or so pages to lay out, but at the same time, most arguments aren't little 2 or 3 step proofs like we saw in the argument against human free will. Most arguments are extended arguments. Extended arguments are simply arguments that are composed of smaller arguments. There are 2 main types of extended argument structure, and we need to be familiar with both of them. The first is linear extended arguments, and the second is parallel extended arguments. It should be added that some arguments can contain a mixture of both linear and parallel structure. Let's take a look at linear extended arguments. Here's an example from earlier, the argument against human free will. It has 3 main premises and a conclusion. But suppose that the person presenting this argument backs up one of their premises. Suppose they offer an argument that supports the 3rd premise, which says that if a human action is strictly determined by prior physical events, then it is unfree. This claim is known as the thesis of incompatibilism. It basically says that being caused and being free are incompatible with each other. Suppose that for whatever reason, the person advancing this argument decides that that premise needs some extra support. So that author or speaker may present a few more premises to support it. For instance, one move might be to advance these 2 claims. If a human action is strictly determined by prior physical events, then it simply could not have been otherwise given those events. And if a human action could not have been otherwise given prior events, then it is unfree. Together, these 2 premises support the 3rd premise in the main argument. Similarly, the author could advance an argument in support of the other 2 premises. In general, linear extended arguments are arguments that offer sub-arguments to support at least some of the premises in other arguments. Let's take a look at parallel extended arguments. One of the best examples of parallel argument structure comes from St. Thomas Aquinas. Famously, Aquinas gave 5 independent proofs of God's existence. We're not going to worry too much about the details of each of these proofs, but I just want to present them in sort of a schematic fashion. So he gave one argument, used a couple of premises, shows that God exists. Then he presented a different argument, and it starts from different premises. So I've given them different numbers. And then he presented a 3rd argument and a 4th argument. and a fifth argument. These arguments don't really link up in any way, the way we saw with linear extended arguments. None of them is an argument in favor of the premises in a different argument. Instead, all 5 of them lead to the exact same conclusion from 5 different sources. They lead to the conclusion that God exists. This is the key characteristic of parallel extended arguments. Parallel extended arguments present multiple independent lines of evidence for the same conclusion. And once again, I'll mention that many arguments, many extended arguments, can have both linear structure as well as parallel structure. Let's take a look at enthymemes. An enthymeme is an incompletely stated argument. Enthymemes may have unstated premises or even unstated conclusions. Most of the arguments that we encounter are enthymematic in one way or the other. Here's a simple example. Your dog is a shepherd, hence your dog will do well in obedience classes. There's definitely a missing premise here that connects the given premise, your dog is a shepherd, to the given conclusion, your dog will do well in obedience classes. When we're reconstructing an argument like this, we need to state the argument as completely as we can. We want to make sure that all of the parts of the argument are on display, because we should have questions about everything that the argument includes. Many enthymemes, many of the unstated premises in an enthymeme are generalizations of one sort or the other. So most generalizations are universal or statistical. Universal generalizations look like these. All cows eat grass, every good boy does fine, no even numbers greater than 2 are primes. Statistical generalizations look like these. 70% of Hanover College students are from Indiana. Most people recover from COVID-19, and cheetahs tend to be very fast runners. This is not always the case that an unstated premise is a generalization, but many times it's the generalization that gets left unstated, and we need to be careful when we state those arguments in standard form, whether we need to select a universal generalization or a statistical generalization. Let's return to that argument about the dog. Your dog is a shepherd, hence your dog will do well in obedience classes. What do you think belongs in the position of the second premise? Here's a possibility. Premise 2, all shepherds do well in obedience classes. Your dog is a shepherd, all shepherds do well in obedience classes, hence your dog will do well in obedience classes is a deductively valid argument. However, take a look at that claim, all shepherds do well in obedience classes. Do you think it's true? Probably not. Very, very young shepherds probably won't do very well in obedience classes. Very, very old shepherds probably won't do well. Maybe shepherds that have been abused all their lives won't do very well. I think a better premise is a statistical generalization. Shepherds tend to do well in obedience classes. For instance, shepherds were bred to work with humans, so they tend to be eager to please, and that makes them much easier to train. If we put the statistical generalization in this argument, the premise is much, much more plausible, but the argument's no longer deductively valid, and that can be okay. In this case, the argument still looks pretty strong. It's an inductively strong argument. Here's an argument in one of the exercise sets from the Salmon text, page 33. Premise 1, marijuana is no more dangerous than alcohol, which is already legal. Therefore, marijuana should be legal. What do you think is the generalization that's missing there? There's a number of ways of filling this in, but something along the lines of the following is probably what's being assumed. Premise 2. Any substance that's no more dangerous than a legal substance should be legal. So the argument reads, marijuana is no more dangerous than alcohol, which is already legal. Any substance that's no more dangerous than a legal substance should be legal. Hence, marijuana should be legal. We find argumentation everywhere. I think even a bumper sticker can contain an argument. This is a famous bumper sticker. You've probably seen it on the road. Abortion stops a beating heart. That's not just a statement. I believe that's actually an argument. How would you reconstruct the argument? We have one premise. Abortion stops a beating heart. But what's the rest of the argument? Well, let's start with what do you think the conclusion probably is? And probably it's something along the following lines. Abortion is wrong. Abortion stops a beating heart, therefore abortion is wrong. Well, what's going to connect the given premise to the given conclusion? Probably something along the following. Stopping a beating heart is wrong. So now the argument reads, abortion stops a beating heart, stopping a beating heart is wrong, therefore abortion is wrong. And once again, now that we have the argument in standard form, we can start to evaluate it. We can start to ask questions about its premises and about the strength of the connection between the premises and the conclusion. We'll conclude with the principle of charity. The principle of charity instructs us to reconstruct an argument in its strongest, most plausible form based on the available textual evidence. It tells us to avoid attributing false premises or fallacious reasoning, if at all possible. Why should we follow the principle of charity? Why should we feel obligated to reconstruct someone else's argument in its strongest, most plausible form? There's a number of reasons why, but I'll start with a relatively simple one. The person whose argument we are reconstructing may not be available to comment on our argument reconstruction, to clarify their argument, or to correct any misconstrual of their argument we might have made. There's a number of reasons they might not be available. If we're reconstructing an argument in a historical text, it's possible that the author has been dead for some time, so they're not going to tap us on the shoulder and tell us that we've misconstrued their argument. Or even if they're not dead, they might not be available for us to run it by them. They might be far away or inaccessible. Bear in mind that reconstructing an argument in a way that makes it weak and easy to dismiss is itself a fallacy. We studied that fallacy last week. Can you remember what it is? The principle of charity is a check against our own biases and motivated reasoning. Remember that the whole point of reconstructing an argument is to be in a position to evaluate the argument. And we want to be able to evaluate an argument because we're considering whether we should adopt the position ourselves. So if we want to do that, and we want to do that honestly, we should follow the principle of charity. We should always reconstruct another person's argument in its strongest, most plausible form.